Scott. He is from Digital IT from Microsoft Internal. Turns out that Microsoft is his customer, and he's our service principal, and he's going to take care of it from here. Scott, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction.
Great.
And I'm going to start sharing. So just to stress, as mentioned, I'm representing the internal customer. So Microsoft has a tenant for our corporate and our federal environments. And in those environments, we have Teams. And Teams is for our internal users. So I'll go through some details on the volume numbers and that sort of thing. But just want to make the grounding very clear because this is my journey as the service engineer tasked with accomplishing compliance with this regulation. I've had some luck being partnered with the product group early on it, and we'll look at a roadmap slide on that as well. But just kind of think about it definitely from that lens versus I'm part of the product group. I help to influence things in the product group and talk about feature capabilities. But just kind of really set that context that I'm similar to like an external customer where we've got a certain set of things we can use inside the product as far as feature and functionality. And in this case, the regulation, which squarely lands on everybody that's a customer and using Teams and enterprise voice or PSTN calling, and the regulation is how it comes from the federal government, we're just as obligated to comply with it. So one other thing just to mention, totally open for the questions, so drop them in the chat. I've asked that they stop me if there's something that we want to dig into a little bit deeper. And, just totally open to that. So please ask your questions. So the regulation, and I know there's a very high chance people are pretty well versed on these details and some of the technical details, but I'm going to step through it at a pace so that someone who may not be grounded has an ability to kind of catch up and at least follow the conversation. So the regulation we're looking at is the Ray-Baum Act, and that the regulation itself, in summary, its obligations around how you're able to get emergency response directed towards a caller, and there's requirements that have changed. And with this one, there's an obligation on the customer to make sure if that user is on their corporate network, they can provide something called the dispatchable location plus a civic address. And that helps, obviously, to get the emergency response much quicker to the location. And then there's also obligations, and we'll look a little bit on the nuances of how someone on the corporate network or off the corporate network will get a location discovered and how that gets delivered to the emergency response team. So context on Microsoft, in this particular regulation and the scope of it as it applies to our corporate buildings, we've got roughly 200 buildings and in those buildings we have roughly 17 million square feet of real estate. And out of that, we've now mapped roughly 175,000 locations for E911 dispatchable accuracy. And just some additional context, the volume of users in scope, we have 80,000 users and roughly 5,000 devices that are enabled and in scope for this regulation. I always want to stress that, considering when you get into this evaluation of the regulation from the federal government, don't overlook the fact that there's state regulations. And that can definitely come into consideration how you're going to approach your dispatchable location accuracy. Are there other parameters maybe have been overlooked? Maybe you want to take another look at. But I've got this representation and this particular deck. This visual comes from Intrado. So Intrado, if you're not familiar with them, they're one of the suppliers of emergency routing services, and they are the company that we've contracted with as a customer. And I'll share out an architectural view a little bit later where they come into play. But essentially, what they do is they provide this service, which once you've delivered dispatchable information, they based upon looking at the information, it's routed to an appropriate emergency response center. So I've used this visual from them, and although you won't get the deck, there is an opportunity on their website. You can click into the state regulations, and I think it's a really good summary because it saves a ton of time going through each state regulation, and it gives you the extractions as far as what are specific to emergency services. So just hopefully that helps and saves you some time. This is the part that I really want to spend a little bit more time, and I'm going to step through each one of these items because the partnership in this effort is foundational. It's absolutely the most important thing that I've worked through and keep maintaining throughout the whole evolution of the start of this all the way up until today. I just actually had a call this morning with my V team to talk through emergency services. So the teams I call out at the top that I've worked with since the beginning of this back in April 2020, the legal team, our product team, real estate, network, emergency response services, and that's the Intrado team I had mentioned just a minute ago, our IT managers, or whoever's responsible for the sites that you have within your portfolio, and then the finance team, because there's definitely a dollar ask associated. So back in April 2020, the product team and my legal team, we sat down and we talked through the regulations to determine what we could do or how we would approach the regulation and how could we potentially accomplish it inside Microsoft. And at that point, I really didn't know the real estate portfolio intently, and I didn't really know all the details from the network team, what was possible. And that's really important because digestion of the regulation by your legal team, it's going to be one of the foundation pieces because your team's going to tell you how you should approach the regulation, what's acceptable from a risk perspective, and all those things. And since the beginning up until today, still have regular check-ins with my legal team, how we're moving along, how we've progressed, and what we're doing to have due diligence in place. So based upon that initial conversation, we started working with the real estate and the network team to evaluate, based upon our real estate portfolio, what was possible, how could we accomplish this location accuracy using network data. And I've called out all the potential capabilities. You can use wireless, BSS-ID, switch MAC and port, or subnet. And it's going to depend how your building's designed and how it's deployed from a network perspective, how you correlate those locations in the building using network information. And in our case, it was really challenging because over the years, our network environment had grown and changed. And in many cases, subnets would extend throughout a building, even in a couple cases across buildings. So subnet wasn't going to be giving us enough granularity. The switch MAC, so if you want to use an entire switch frame and basically say all those endpoints are in your dispatchable location, it may be possible for you, but for us it wasn't, because all of those ports, they would run from one floor maybe up to the third floor and maybe down to the first floor. So we didn't have the ability to just use a switch MAC. So we actually had to get a bit more granular. So we had to go down to the switch MAC, switch port. And we also are leveraging BSS-ID for our wireless environment, which the subnet piece, it was something we decided against because of the current breakout of it. But if we had made changes for subnet, we would have been in a pretty big complication, because we changed since that point in 2020 from having local controllers to having a centralized controller. So our subnet ranges have collapsed. So we would have had a bunch of rework to have to happen. So now into 2021, we started our E911 database mapping. So to build our location information server. So all the data we put into Teams. It was a bit labor intensive. We went through buildings. We physically evaluated where you were in the building by the network jack or the BSS-ID and the signal, and we correlated specific address locations within the building down to the room and the JAG. So it was a lot of work, and that definitely did cost us some money internally. We had a supplier team that did it, and it took a bit of time for that to get accomplished. The next piece, and just to kind of set some context, and this order is probably a little bit out of alignment, probably should have this first point about global ownership of the network closets. As you start this process of mapping your environment, you want to make sure that you're containing it to a manageable change management process. And what I mean by that is it's not static. There's going to be network changes. There's going to be new switches come in, new wireless APs. And that has to be thought through, because when that does happen, the network environment has that big impact on emergency services, because when you make that change, the wireless AP that was previously there is no longer correlated to that particular building. If you just basically recycle it and throw it away, then that's one thing. But if you move it to another building, now the location information server has representation of the previous building. So there's really tight coordination of what happens in the change management process is extremely important. And then the other piece there, and I call it out, is initially our network closets, they're owned by multiple teams. So our network closets they weren't extremely locked down to who could get in there. You obviously needed a badge and you had to be part of a permission group, but that didn't limit down to a level where we were confident. So a particular team inside the company took ownership of it. We locked it down to a very small number of individuals, and there's also a process for just-in-time access, and I'll make a reference to it later on. So anytime somebody needs to get in that room, there's a administrative form they have to fill out, and that basically initiates the process for them to get in. I mentioned Intrado earlier, and this is the last bullet in this column on 2021, is we implemented a new routing process. So all the 911 calls at a particular point in time, we routed them to Intrado. It didn't mean that every location was mapped yet, but there's inside of Intrado's service, they have a call center. So if information comes across, it's blank, not validated. For us, we didn't have everything completed when we made this switch, but we had a much higher level of emergency response than I would say than the previous architecture. So what would happen at this point, the call would be initiated. If the appropriate information was available, it would route to the most appropriate response center. But if it wasn't, then their triage center would take the call and determine based upon information that provided to them where to route the response. The next column, 2022, once we've completed all our E911 mappings, we have that level of confidence, and we've got the rigor around our change management. And we started looking at the additional features that were becoming available inside the product, like the external lookup feature. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, on the next slide. Our real estate team, this is something, and I mentioned the partnerships, just to make sure that things don't happen, not just from a network perspective, but a real estate perspective that's not within your purview. A new building could come online, an expansion of a wing, a change in a building. All those things have to be considered as part of change management. And we even went as far as to say, although it's not a certificate of occupancy requirement, any new building, like our East Campus, we have 9 buildings in our East Campus in Puget Sound that were built out. Before anyone could work in those buildings, we had to have those buildings mapped for emergency services. And it was part of the occupancy requirement. It's not a certificate requirement per se, but it was definitely understood that this is from our perspective, a legal requirement and absolutely necessary. So in the current state, what am I looking at? So 2025 and forward, I'm working with the product team, so defining and testing what's possible to expand on reporting capabilities and potential co-pilot scenarios. I mean, I don't have anything to disclose here, but like things as a customer of the service, I think about, I mean, I'd love to know, is there somebody that's checking into my into my Liz, but there's no location. So why is that? A report, some kind of recognition. And other types of reporting things that you might think about as you get into this that would be beneficial. And that's where I'm working with the product team to help evaluate what's important to me as a customer. Still looking at global, like what is it globally? Like I know that there's some regulations popping up in other countries that are aligning not necessarily directly with what we've got in the US, but absolutely have to keep my eyes there and adjust when necessary. The team's product group, I'm sure, is doing the same thing. I haven't had a recent conversation on that topic, but if a regulation comes up that's requiring adjustments, I'm sure we're going to have to look there. And then the last thing, just to call out in this particular roadmap, I have been talking in Trado about hosting our building schematics, and then this is a possibility that they can do today. It's not built into the regulations today, but I mean, I don't know what the next gen or future Ray Baum Act type things will be, but there is a potential for me to send them all of my building maps, and then they can, as part of the routing to the emergency response center, can include an image. I always think about, and just another aside, is any of these things along the way that we've looked at, evaluated, discussed with my legal team, it's always, is it going to improve life safety? Like that's the most important piece here. Like, is it going to improve life safety, or are we going to add too much complexity where you're actually maybe detracting from the potential for help? So that's just an overarching thing. And I mentioned that now with this building schematics because I think it's definitely would help. If you send a relevant building schematic, although it's not specifically showing like a blinking dot where that person's located, it gives a bit of a sense of what the building looks like, and before they arrive to the response center, sorry, to the building where the person needs response. And I'll take a little breath just to see if there's any questions so far.
Yeah, there have been some questions, but I think the team's been getting a majority of them. I think Michael just asked one, but I don't know if that's specific. I don't think that's something you'd be able to answer. That might be something the Converge Comms we're going to try to jump on, but I think you're good so far, Scott.
Okay, sounds good. So the next area I'm going to talk about is just the technical, like the big technical buckets that we looked at. So configuring our call routing, and this is where within the team's product as an admin, you need to determine based upon your the type of calling solution that you're using, and I'm going to represent that, and I didn't mention, but inside Microsoft, we use both direct routing and some calling plans. So in calling plans, this call routing, the partner is already predefined. So calling plans, that comes as part of your solution. In direct routing, it's different. You need to determine, because you're owning your circuit, you're owning your SBC, your session border controller. What are you going to do with your emergency services calls? And so we made the decision for our direct routing to leverage Intrado. And so this is the path, and I've got an architectural view in a later slide we can look at, where when those 911 calls are made, those calls are passed over to Intrado, so our provider. So this was a pretty important decision, and it takes some time because you've got contracts you have to work through and so on and so forth. But this was definitely one of the big ones to figure out exactly who we're going to use, how we're going to partner with them, the contracts, the pricing, the budgets, all those things. The next one is the trusted IP addresses. So this is essentially your public IP presence within your corporate environment. And why that's important is it helps the team's client and the team's product to determine whether an evaluation should happen inside of what you've built as a database. So the location information server that you've built inside of Teams. So once the client has this recognition of what its public IP is, it presents it to Teams. And I have another slide that kind of walks through this piece as well. And based upon what you've entered in your trusted IP space, that determination is made. Yes, it's part of my corporate network, or no, it's not. Assigning emergency addresses, and this is what we talk through, going through not only the foundation of mapping locations in the next bullet on the network ID identifiers, but you have to go through and assign each building with specific information, a civic address, as well as the geocodes. So they kind of go hand in hand. The first one is you're assigning the emergency addresses, and then the second part is you're building those network identifiers to make sure that that building has underneath it all the appropriate dispatchable locations built out using the network information. And then these two policies at the end, you've got your call routing policy to determine your mask number, as well as your PSTN route per number. And finally, the emergency calling policy, which it defines your security desk notification. So whether you want somebody to be conferenced into the call or not, do you want them to have a chat that's initiated, as well as the external lookup functionality. And this is the part where you're basically giving the Teams client this recognition that if it's not a public IP that's recognized as one of your trusted IPs, what does it do? And it goes into this external lookup functionality, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slides. As well as an emergency service disclaimer banner. And I've got an image of that in the next slide. Nope, sorry, the following slide, but we'll talk through this external lookup first. On the corporate network first. So when the client is on our network and in a corporate building, what happens is the client will check in with Teams, and Teams will take a look at the trusted IP space against the public IP. And based upon that, we'll look a little bit deeper and looks into our location information server. And what we've built as an admin, and this is all that work I mentioned earlier about mapping the locations, it'll take and evaluate based upon whatever BSSID, whatever subnet. I mentioned we don't use subnets, but if you're using subnets, your switch MAC and port, and determine what did we map in our Liz. And so once that's captured by the Teams client, and this is happening on regular intervals, and the most important kind of thing is a network condition change, that Teams client will have this cached. So if that user then made a 911 call, this information would flow in the SIP PID flow as part of the header through to Intrado. Their routing service will take a look at that information and directly route it to the most appropriate emergency response center. You might hear the term PSAP. So that's where your fire, emergency, whichever, will get response. The other scenario is when the client is off the corporate network. So the trusted IP doesn't match up with the public IP being presented. A couple different processes happen here. What will happen is in the dial pad, below the dial pad in the Teams client, you're given an option to add your address or to adjust the address, because the Teams client, if you've added external lookup as one of the capabilities, will attempt to use Windows Location Services and Azure Maps to discover your location. Now, if it's accurate and you confirm that confirm the accuracy of the address, it would flow almost exactly like if the user was on the corporate network. It's a confirmed location. It would go to the routing service. It's a confirmed address, and it would go to the emergency response. That would also happen in the case you start typing and you change the address, and it's an auto-suggested address that's accepted and confirmed. That flow would happen. In the case that you don't accept it, or you start typing and you completely change the address, it's not an auto-suggested address, then there's this process of having the triage center get involved. So, and what would happen is the call would flow through, the routing service would see it's not a confirmed address, and it would go to their national call center. The part here I also want to mention is this banner I called out that you're able to configure. This is a free text space that we have included for all of our users. It just is a reminder to take a look down at the dial pad, make adjustments. And we also call it to not use Teams when traveling outside your country or your home, your region or country. And there's just a lot of complications, and we've just made the decision that there should be other backup plans for making calls other than emergency services and Teams. And that's where we've got this disclaimer. We've got some additional details on our internal websites. And we also work with our travel team, so they post additional context and pre-travel emails, because there's parts to it even outside of Teams. If you're using your cell phone, you get an international plan. You need to know what to do if you're dialing emergency services in that country using a local carrier. So there's a lot of pieces here, even beyond Teams and what we've done for emergency services, that's been exposed as part of this, and we've done certain things. This banner, messages that go out to users in email prior to traveling, travel website updates, that sort of thing. I had mentioned change management. So a couple things: the just-in-time network access being locked down, and also inside of our network closets. Okay, we took ownership. Particular teams took ownership. But we also place signs which has a QR code and a location URL that's called out that points them towards a change management power app that we created. These are not part of the product. This is an internally developed thing. We have a power app for both change management as well as our audit tool, and I'll talk through those in a little bit. But don't know how far along you are. What level of changes you might have. I mean, we've done internally these power apps for change. We did the power app for change management, but the same could be accomplished using a ticket with a spreadsheet. But we approached it a little bit differently, put some engineering cycles into it, and I can talk through those as well. Before we get to the power apps, I'm going to just glance at the architecture and data flow. So on the left side, as you take a look at the two sources of our data, we've got, as a result of doing these audits, we collected information using LLDP, and that helps with the wired details. But there's also network data that's coming to us from the wireless AP BSSID side. So both of these pieces of information are being fed into a SQL database that we're leveraging to combine the information, run scripted updates into our team's environments. And I probably didn't mention, but we also have a corporate environment and a government tenant. So we have two tenants that we do this same update into. So all the Liz database matches are exactly the same in both of our tenants. And that information happens anytime there's a change that gets fed through. We've got our change management app here. Anytime a change comes in the SQL database, there's automation that runs that updates these two databases here. And then you can just kind of see the rest of it. There's already talked through. You've got your Intrada routing service, the National Call Center, and then the Emergency Response Center. I know I'm simplifying it greatly, but hopefully it's kind of landing. This is a little bit more about the routing architecture. So this is how we have it from our corporate environment. We established with Intrado, we decided to do IPsec tunnels over to them. So our 911 calls, they don't hit, let's say, PSTN. They go directly through an IPsec tunnel over to Intrado. And so that was something we decided as a customer. I mean, there's options. You don't have to go that route. I think Intrado engineering mentioned that a good portion of people just do open internet. But we did establish IPsec tunnels over to them, so our routes go there. 911 calls go that path. And then based upon the decision, like I mentioned earlier, whether it's a confirmed address or it's not confirmed, the interaction between the National Call Center is going to happen or not. Another little breath just to check. Is there any questions that might have popped up that you want me to address?
No, Scott, you're nailing it.
Okay, good. So the change management tool, there's two tools we've developed. PowerApp is the platform we decided to use. This particular tool, the change management one I mentioned, there's a lot of pieces going on here, and it could absolutely be done using a ticketing system, a spreadsheet. With our number of buildings, the amount of network refresh that happens in the environment, we wanted to get it into the hands of the people that were doing the work so the changes could happen quicker. It's not to say we couldn't do it the other way with the spreadsheet and tickets. We wanted to try approaching it from the perspective not only to do it for ourselves, but maybe think about, is this a co-development opportunity that might be beneficial for the product? I know that the product's come a long way since we started using the capability, and there are additional functionalities built into the Teams admin console that help facilitate some of these pieces. So we built it early on just because we were kind of pioneers and we wanted to make sure we were ready to support this and so on and so forth. But just to walk through basically what it does, you can select any one of the buildings that are currently configured, or you can add a new building, and that adding of a building action would happen only if it was available as a newly defined real estate location. So we couldn't just arbitrarily build a building here. It's got to come as part of the data flow from our network, from our real estate portfolio. Once you've got a building in there, we can go through making changes on the wireless APs, add or remove. We've got bulk upload capabilities, and that bulk upload capability is basically a spreadsheet. So I guess it depends how you want to approach this. There's different ways to do it, but we decided, like I said, to use this Power App. The next thing I would say is similarly, you could do, auditing. Like, I don't know, based upon your conversation with your legal team or internally, how you're going to want to approach due diligence, just making sure you're keeping hygiene and validating the accuracy of information. We've decided to go through and do an audit. So we're doing roughly 5% per building on the wired and wireless space. And for us to ease the process for our real estate team, who agreed to do the work, they went through and they assisted initially last year just using spreadsheets, which was cumbersome over email, got complicated, lots of challenges there. And I think the important thing is, everybody's working against a budget. So when you're making things difficult, we wanted to approach it and figure out how to make it easier for the team. So as opposed to us funding a supplier to go building by building to do this, we've decided let's invest in a Power App, makes it easier for the local folks to go through and do the audit. And this is what we came up with. So essentially what happens is Power App, you select a building, you generate the audit. It gives you a sampling of these locations, and you can then go through each one of these locations and make a determination. Okay, I'm standing in this particular floor on this particular building. Do I get all this information registered into Teams? Is this what I'm seeing, or is it not? If it is, audit was good. If it's not, audit was bad. We've got some other distinctions there. There was no network or I think just in other fields, so you could put some other details, and that generates an issues log. And so what happens at that point, once the auditor has gone through all these audit locations, the IT manager, if you remember the partnership slide, the IT manager is then responsible to take a look at the issues log and determine what's happened. Now, if it's like all up failing, and that hasn't happened yet, but like just say hypothetically it was, the team I had mentioned earlier that we meet on a weekly basis, we talk about things in emergency services, we would be getting a notification upon the completion of that audit that there were 15 issues. That's going to spark our interest. We're going to dig into it, figure out what happened. Maybe a network change happened and it wasn't respectively updated into change management. So we'll dig into that. But this one, there's ways to approach this as well. But I would say definitely, discussions with legal team, figure out what makes sense to y'all. But for us, we're doing not only from this perspective, just a due diligence hygiene check. We also have hygiene evaluations in our network data feed. We have hygiene evaluations in our Liz database. So all those pieces are happening. And it's kind of an ongoing thing. So it's important to note that this isn't not a set and be done sort of thing. And then just, if you have any other questions that weren't answered, obviously, I worked on I co-authored a blog that kind of, gives pretty much the same talk. And it's got details. Just if you want to go out into the tech community, you can find it under this heading. Learn how Microsoft enabled company-wide emergency calling in the US with Microsoft Teams Phone. So you can read up on it there. It's pretty much the same talk track, so but it's available. And that is the end of my presentation. Any open questions that might be hanging there we want to talk through?
Do you have that link handy? We could drop it in for that blog.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. I think that would be really helpful. Great insight. Really great material.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
So let us, I know there's already a couple people that are asking to come on, so give us a second. I'm going to allow the mic for attendees, so just give me 2 seconds on that. And
Policy
then
change.
we'll call on a couple people. I think Richard Simon is the first one who raised their hand. So do you have a question for Scott?
Thank you. Thank you, Donald. My question is, we test around and we struggle around, let's say, this time by Siemens Energy with exactly this way forward to use the MAC addresses. First of all, our network team decide that our access points will move the MAC address, and with this the BSS ID, but we are working on it. But my question is, how can you be sure that your access points in the buildings are not cover the floor below or behind or above?
I got the question. Yeah, that's a great question, and there is definitely a potential for bleed. But the change in recognition of a higher intensity signal should pick up. And we really haven't had that big of a challenge. As we do these audits, it's been pretty accurate. As we were doing our collection of BSS ID information, it was accurate. But you're absolutely correct. There's always a potential for bleed.
Okay. Because we have the same problem, yeah.
Yep. I think you're gonna come to certain points where you're gonna say, okay, I'm in an open atrium. Where am I catching my signal from? What do I define as a dispatchable location? Like all those things that come up, and you've got a point of like, how do I approach this? I think that the part that's important is discuss it with your legal team on your proposal. Make sure that it makes sense to them. And that's what I've done all along. Like anything that we approach that's a little bit strange, like we don't really know exactly how to slice it. I have a conversation with them just to make sure what we're thinking, what we're going to implement makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for this.
Thanks, Scott.
Anybody else want to come off or come on, Mike and Scott? Yeah, please raise your hand before we do that.
Yeah. Any questions, Scott? Please raise your hand. We'll get you in. Randy, Don, do you want to?
Yeah, one of the first slides that you were showing that you had 17 million, is it 17 million employees, but only like 80,000 are licensed for making outgoing calls, 5,000 devices. As you can see, is that not everybody actually gets the license to place outbound calls. So that has been sort of like one of the considerations that we're actually going through, is not everybody is licensed for making outgoing calls, but there's always the potential chance, as we all know, to call emergency services.
Yep.
Licensed or not, is there going to, like, I know that we could create a auto attendant that if you actually dial 911, even though you don't have the license, you can still dial 911. It'll find the resource account to find the auto attendant, and then the auto attendant can place the phone call for you, for that person. So this is where it's almost like is there something that is...
There is, yeah. No, I see where you're going with that one. Have you looked into shared calling? Because I know that was something that Shane had dropped in and that was talked about. So shared calling, think of that as, and thank you, Greg, for doing that. It's community calling, especially for 911. So with shared calling, you have the ability to have one phone number and up to 10,000 users on that, being able to do 911 out. And the most important piece about that is that even if, say for instance, Jonathan calls 911 and he's in the office there, it's going to know, because of the way it's set up, that it was Jonathan and not me that called 911, and it's going to use that information to be able to go to Jonathan. Now, the caveat on shared calling is that if you're using calling plans, it's built in, right? You have to double check and make sure if your direct routing or operator connect that they're going to honor shared calling, right? And make sure that works. But we found a lot of customers that are utilizing that to be able to get over that scenario.
But doesn't shared calling also only take effect for people that actually, or accounts that actually are licensed for making outgoing calls?
So they have to be enterprise voice enabled for that to work. So yes, they have to have that piece, but they don't have to have a calling plan.
Correct.
Right? They don't have to have that piece of it, but they still have to have the other part. Yes.
Correct.
Sure. I dropped a slide in the chat. It shows you a little bit more about setting that up, and I'll drop the link in from our YouTube channel from last month when we had the team summit. We actually did a deep dive on shared calling, so I'll drop that in as well.
And remember, if they're not enterprise voice enabled, they're not going to get a dial pad to be able to dial 911 anyway. So that's kind of the key differentiator. I know it gets into licensing and so forth, but if they're licensed for phone, then they can be enterprise voice enabled, and shared calling allows you to do that, get the dial pad, and place the outbound call on a single calling plan.
And I think just a piece of clarification, like in the US, that 17 million number, it was the square feet of real estate. We do have, I think it's almost the equal share. Like we don't, it's going to be different for external customers when you start looking at licensing and that sort of thing. So in general, if a user is enabled with an account in the United States, they get a phone number. So it's almost a 1-for-1. So that 80,000 number is pretty much all of our US based users. That's why it's just wanted to make that clarity, but you're absolutely correct. There's going to be companies and decisions that have to be made, whether it's local budget, whether it's licensing. So very, very important distinction there. But for us, just to, we haven't done that sort of dissection of user who gets a phone number versus doesn't.
Thank you.
Sure.
I believe Nestor has a question if you want to come on off mute.
Hey guys.
Hey Nestor.
Just a quick question. With the E911, is there a feature with Microsoft Team phones to trigger an alert real time when associate call 911 with our internal security team or health and safety team?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that configuration option that I was mentioning, it's basically built into the calling policy. So you can have a security desk notification happen for every emergency services call.
Yep. It's part of the emergency policy section within the voice area. And you can have multiple ones. So if you have different locations that has a specific physical desk, you can set it up for, these get this policy, and then that would ring that desk, and these and that location would bring this desk. So you can set those up separately.
Absolutely.
Can I have a follow-up question? We're on retail, and sometimes there's I don't know whether it's associated to 911. There are some threats, and at the same time we call 911. Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether do we have a way to track also those kind of calls in MS Team, or that's a different discussion? Like a threat, a call from external call, let's say a bomb,
Oh, you mean inbound
right?
calls?
And then we
Inbound
have
call, okay.
ability to hold that hold that call and then call 911. That sometimes they investigate based on that. I'm trying to understand. There's what they call the so those kind of threats calls.
Interesting.
What I would say is you're going to have your logs from your whatever type of calling technology, your SBC logs, but in certain cases, even the phone number it comes from could be spoofed. So it's a bit challenging. I don't know anything specific that's built to kind of address that topic.
Yeah, that's it. That one I'm not sure either. I don't know if Shane or
Yeah, it's the
Pratik
pictures
or
from
Jeff-
other partners, another vendor called Crisis Alert. So I'm just
Okay.
trying to understand whether there's a picture that's associated to 911 as well. But probably we'll
Yeah.
just ask it with my other my Microsoft contact if there's a pictures or future development on that. I think
let's
doesn't touch any on that.
Let's take that offline and see, get a little bit more details on that, and maybe see if we can come up with a solution on that. Thank you. All right, Eric, I think you're up.
Hey, yeah, we have a Western Toronto system also. We're currently have Cisco phones looking to go towards Teams calling. So that's why I was attending these. And one challenge, it's not really with the phones or the network. It's more like we have remote locations that are so remote they don't have a legal street address. And all we have is maybe like a city, state, and we usually try to fake in the GPS coordinates so Intrado gets it at their Boulder, Colorado center. These would be like telecom tower sites and things like that. I don't know if you had any challenges like that. I was just looking to see if you comparing notes, if you ran across maybe sites that are hard to define as far as legal street addresses.
We don't we didn't run into that, but what I would suggest, because it sounds like you got a very unique situation, is definitely discuss with your legal team and there's the option that you don't put anything in there if it's not an actual civic address, and the response center, their triage response center, just works through the call. But if you've got something already in place with them where they're going to accept that civic address, which is kind of a faked address, the only piece I would say is just make sure your legal team's part of the conversation and everybody's, fully nodding their heads that makes the most sense. Because, like I said earlier, you want to make sure whatever you're doing is improving the aspects of life safety, and there's nothing adding like complexity to it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That everybody agrees that that's the simplest, fastest path to get safety there. But yeah, I just was curious if you could run any situations like that where you had remote sites that were hard to define.
Not yet. Not yet. But interesting point. Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Any questions before we take it home? I see Richard has one. Is there a way to use Windows location services for geolocations for E911?
Is there a way to use? So it's a combination. So basically, that's where you can enter your specific address. And what's the part that's happening is below that dial pad. When you start typing, the auto suggest is trying to complete based upon its known civic addresses. So I don't know if that's answering the question.
And I think, Richard, I guess the other part to that is that you're talking outside of your network, and I'm assuming that is the case, right? That would be that dynamic 911 capability that's built into Teams, that you do need that. You need your boundaries kind of figured out first, right? So yeah, that verify. Yes, that is exactly that piece, verifying that that's the address that you actually are in. And that would be utilizing should be utilizing Windows location services to do that if you have it enabled. That's the most important piece.
Yeah, and that goes on to Jeff's question next about mapping locations.
Mhm.
Right. Jeff, you come off of mute if you'd like to elaborate.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, we just run into issues where users, they can go in, their Teams client comes up, they put in their address and it can't be found, so it never gets verified, right? But they can add it in manually. But the question is, is there a way or some ways to update the map information to include their addresses? Because you can find it in Google Maps, Bing Maps, and all the external map applications, no problem. It just seems to be something with whatever map service is being used for Teams.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've got a similar challenge. It always finds me 2 streets over from my house, so I have to go in and make those updates. What I can say is I've had conversations with the product group, and the way they have presented it's going to continue to get better. And that's the part that's important to understand, that they're doing as much as they can to build that level of accuracy. But I totally agree. Like there's definitely still gaps.
Thank you.
All right, Randy, I think you have your hand up for a question, or not?
Yes, I do. It was just
Okay,
more
good.
of that within the slides. You actually showed three more presentations that are coming up, and one of them was the Intune device.
Yes. Yep.
I've already logged in and I cannot seem to find that specific session. I don't know if you can
Well, that's coming in the future. We have.
Okay, so is it going to be sent out? Okay, good.
Yeah,
enough.
we're going to get that stuff going here. And I'm trying to remember. I think what was that?
It's actually the link's updated. So
yeah, he just did that. So if you use the same one to connect, it's the
URL.
MS.
We use the same URL every single month for registration. So
perfect.
You can't go wrong.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll put. Yeah, here's. I've actually updated it. Practical Teams device rollout and Intune conditional policies. There it is. It's all ready to go. So sign on up.
Thank you.
Please. Yep.
That's what's going on. But,
all right.
Yeah, I think. Do we have any?
Dan has another question.
Yeah, let it up. On off mute.
Did you answer my question in the chat? Just because
Did we?
Did somebody?
Yeah, so I just want to confirm that our default is we will look for the location mappings defined in Teams before we default to location services for 911.
So let me just ask a little bit of a question. So you're saying when the client is on the corporate network and is presented a trusted IP into Teams or not?
Yeah, so here's my working example. I'm at home right now, and of course I don't have my home IP defined in the network map because
which probably you shouldn't. You shouldn't do that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, we shouldn't. But I mean, it's just working purposes. Then I decide I'm going to go to my Illinois office today, and when I log in and attach to my WAN, I'm going to grab a corporate IP that I have mapped out in Teams. It'll look to use that location before it passes my location services.
Correct.
Okay, and then if I go ahead and pick up and go to California the next week, then boom, rinse and repeat.
Yes.
Correct. And that's kind of that's a great point, because that's kind of at the core of it, the whole reason this thing was built, because you don't want to have somebody making a 911 call that's typically based out of New York, getting a New York response when you're in New York, but in California you call 911, guess who you're getting again? New York PSAP. I mean, that has been, foundationally one of the reasons this was built. So your address comes as a result of where you're located.
Yeah. And that's passed by your Intrado or your Red Sky sub-provider, or can you define that in Teams and cut them out?
We define it in Teams, but the routing actually happens with the provider. So once we send in the SIP PID flow the address information, that civic address and the dispatch location, Intrado has those relationships with the local PSAPs. It takes a look at that information in their routing engine and determines, oh, this is a confirmed address. that person's in New York on Fifth Ave in this building at this location and routes to that particular PSAP. So that's where the core of, you know, the budget asks that if you're going to negotiate with Intrado, like that part of it comes into play. You've got to basically buy their service. They're routing the calls for you, with the caveat based upon information you entered into Teams.
Good. Thanks. Just wanted to double confirm that one.
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, and we had us